Hey guys, Pastor Ben here with another review and reflection. Today I want to talk about Paul Tripp's book, Parenting 14 Gospel Principles That Can Radically Change Your Family. I've been reading Paul Tripp for many years at this point. He was a big name in my household growing up. My parents had us go through some of his counseling materials in our homeschooling years and the high school years. Very helpful for understanding both myself, my own heart, how sin works, how sanctification works, and learning how to try to communicate those truths to others and come alongside and help them, especially in times of conflict. And Tripp is someone who has written a lot on a wide number of issues, counseling issues, marriage issues, parenting issues, things like that. But he jokes, I read a book of his on leadership, and he jokes that he's really only written one book. He just keeps rewriting it with a different topic in mind. And that is, every book he's writing is exploring the gospel and how the gospel impacts and changes the way that we view ourselves before God and the way we interact with others as instruments in God's hands. And that's really what he's doing in this book on parenting. Some of you may be familiar with Paul Tripp's parenting work. Of course, there's the older book, Shepherding a Child's Heart, that he wrote with his brother. He's done a number of conferences, video series, things like that. So if you've read any of those materials, there's going to be a lot in this book that is probably kind of repeat or reminders. I will say I think he has probably tried to kind of refine and distill and tighten up some things that were maybe a bit broader or open to misinterpretation in some of the other older works. So there's still value in this, even if you have those older books. And if you haven't read Paul Tripp on any of this, this 14 Gospel Principles is probably the book that I would recommend that you get. It's going to give you kind of his most mature thought on these things. And so what Tripp does in this book, we just went through it in our adult Sunday school at the church where I have the privilege of pastoring, Catoctin Covenant Presbyterian Church in Purcellville, Virginia. And what Tripp does is to lay out 14 principles that can guide and shape us as parents, thinking about our work and our role. And each of these principles builds on the other. Just walking through the table of contents is a good exercise to sort of see. He's got the name of the principle, calling, grace, law, and then kind of a one sentence description of what that is. And when you just walk through the table of contents, you see a lot about what the book is going to cover. But what he's trying to do is to, as he puts it in the introduction, build a kind of theological framework for the task of parenting. He argues that when he does these parenting conferences and things, that people often think that what they most need is kind of the magic key, the secret, the inside scoop on how do you get your kids to behave, or how should you handle this very specific situation, curfews when they're teenagers, or getting them to eat food when they're toddlers, or, whatever it might be. And Tripp says there's a place for those discussions, but often what leaves us floundering as parents, or what gets us off track as parents, is the fact that we are parenting untheologically. Or maybe to put it more precisely, we're parenting with bad theology in place. Now, again, at that point, you kind of think, well, this sounds exactly like what a Presbyterian would recommend. It sounds so abstract, but, stick with it. What Tripp shows us is that the way that the Bible leads us to think about ourselves, to think about our children, and to think about our relationship as a family to God is very important for how you approach the task of parenting. Because if you see your role as being the owner of your kids, and that your job is to get your kids to obey or conform, kind of outwardly speaking, in their behavior so that they can be successful people, accomplished people, respected people, and if you see your value and self-worth tied to their performance, then that's going to have radical implications for how you parent those kids and how you talk to those kids. But if you recognize a more biblical perspective, that we as parents are not the owners of our kids, but rather we are ambassadors to them from God, who is the one who truly has authority over our children, that we are functioning with a delegated authority, like an ambassador would from one country to another, that changes our understanding of our role. All of a sudden, our role is not to get our kids to conform to our will, nor is it to just help them achieve their own vision of their life. Rather, it's to help them conform to God's will, to God's word. And so our task becomes primarily one of preaching and modeling the gospel for them, confessing when we have made mistakes, repenting and asking their forgiveness when we have sinned against them. Because doing that is not undermining our authority or something. It's rather underscoring God's authority. And that's very important. And Tripp will talk about ideas like that and the ways that they apply in all sorts of different situations and scenarios. If you've read Tripp's books in the past, you'll know that he loves to include a lot of examples and stories. Those can be very helpful, both to make it kind of a quick read. This is not a very long book, 200 pages, very easily written, which is helpful because a lot of us as parents don't have a lot of time to do deep reading and things. And so these are written in such a way that you can read them quickly, you can relate to them well. He'll have questions for you to think about and talk about with your spouse, and will often kind of guide you to a few key scriptures that can help orient you to thinking about the different aspects of these things. So I found a lot valuable in this book. As one person put it when we finished up our class the other week, they said, I was encouraged that there wasn't anything brand new in this book. If you've grown up in the church, if you're familiar with the gospel, if you know the theology, then what this book will do is to remind you, A, there is no golden key that you're missing. Parenting is just hard, and we're going to make mistakes. But B, God has given us what we need to be faithful parents and to be fruitful parents and effective parents in His Word. And so the key is always being reformed according to Scripture, going back to the Word and letting that shape and inform our work and our witness as parents. So I found this to be very useful in that regards. If I have a criticism of the book, here's what it would be. I think Paul Tripp's great strength can at times be overplayed and become a weakness. I think his strength is he does a good job of challenging some of the false paradigms or faulty paradigms that people bring to parenting, a very kind of law-oriented, behavior-oriented approach, and pushing us to remember the importance of grace, the role of the gospel, all of those kinds of things, heart transformation and that type of thing. Where I think that can become a weakness is, I think Tripp kind of assumes that the main problem is really going to come from just one direction. And that is probably true in some context. I've, growing up, talking to different people, I know that there's circles and subcultures where that legalism is very strong and very heavy, that focus on outward behavior is very strong and very heavy. But that's not the case everywhere. And I would actually suggest, not only within the context of the church, but probably in the context of the culture, that's not the default of most parenting philosophies. I think a lot of parenting philosophies are more oriented toward, what Carl Trueman and others have called expressive individualism. A lot of people view themselves as parents as being kind of life coaches, or their job is to empower their child. And there can be, in many cases, a kind of reaction to a heavy-handed, legalistic parenting that people maybe grew up with in the baby boomer generation or something. And that is not necessarily, the default position of people stepping into the role of parenting. So Paul Tripp's book is very good for all of us because we've all got that legalist in our heart. So that's an inbuilt tendency. But I wish that he had also kind of balanced out where we are in our culture now and maybe allowed that to shape some of the examples that he gave in the book, some of the applications that he gives in the book. And that maybe leads to one other kind of just thing to keep in mind. Tripp is very good at having kind of pithy quotes that will grab you. But what can sometimes happen there is that there's kind of this dualism. We're not trying to change our kids' outward behavior. We're trying to change their heart. Is that true or not? Well, in one sense, yes, it is. What we are after, ultimately speaking, as parents, should be their regeneration and their conformity to Jesus Christ in their life now. So we're not content with just them sitting still in the pew. We want them to participate in worship, right? We want their hearts to be engaged. So to that extent, absolutely, the quote holds. However, that can be kind of woodenly applied in a way that glosses over the fact that part of our task as parents is to help them behave and to teach and train them in that. And that at different ages and stages, you're going to have to do different kinds of heart work. And so I think some parents can maybe they respond to a context they grew up with. They like Tripp's emphasis on grace and gospel, but it can leave them almost feeling like they're not sure how to do that because they think, I can't just spank my kid. I can't just discipline them because that's just dealing with the behavior, not the heart. How do I navigate those things? And so I wish that he maybe had spent a bit more time nuancing some things. That loses some of the rhetorical punch of what he's doing, but we don't want to, as Christian parents, fall into a kind of simplistic dichotomy of it's this or it's that. Often, biblically speaking, it's both. So there's, I think, complexity and nuance that needs to be added to this as it's worked out in real life. But the context of your local church, a community of like-minded friends, is a great place to do that. And this book is probably going to help to raise good questions, balance out some areas where we can tend to go wrong here, and be helpful for all of us who are called to be parents and all of us who are called to help parents, which is everyone in the church. One final word I'll say, and we made this point in our class. There are some of us who are, actively raising kids right now, and so a book like this seems very applicable and present. But one of the things that people said again and again as we went through this as a church, with people who were, all the way from grandparents down to college and high school students, was that there was so much that applies beyond the bounds of parenting. Again, what Tripp is doing at the end of the day is plumbing the depths of the gospel and saying, how does that shape our relationship to God and our relationships to each other? And he has a particular emphasis on parenting. So that's where the examples come from. There's some particular applications, but so much of it goes beyond that. Because at the end of the day, we never outgrow the gospel. We never grow beyond our need for that. And Tripp is very helpful in drawing out those things and applying them to the particular issue of parenting. So I would highly recommend this book, Paul David Tripp's Parenting, 14 Gospel Principles that can radically change your family.